Bryant here for Directus. In this video, we're diving deeper into workflow automation using Directus Flows. This video is just one in a series of videos where we'll teach you how to recreate some of the most common use cases for Directus Flows step by step. Directus makes creating polished and scalable internal apps really fast and easy. And today we're covering how to use Directus Flows to enhance and add new functionality to your internal tools and apps. So enough talk from me, let's hop right into our first use case. I've got a sample internal app pulled up here, just a simple CRM/project tracker. And we're going to be updating an item whenever a certain event happens inside Directus. More specifically, anytime a user completes a task. So whenever the status equals completed, we want to record that timestamp so that we can use that for reporting and also just to make sure that everything is completed on time. But first, let's go into our data model for our tasks and actually create that date completed field. So I'll just click create field and I'm going to choose the date time field type and I'll just give it a key of date completed and then we'll save. I'll do some quick formatting here to make sure it looks nice on the UI, and then we'll get started with our flow. So let's navigate to our flows under the settings and just create a new flow. I'm going to call this flow update date completed when task equals completed. Then I'll give this an icon and a color because the designer in me has to make things pretty. Moving on to our trigger, we're going to use the event hook. So this is triggered based on platform or data events. And I'm going to choose action non-blocking, which simply means this is going to trigger after the item is updated. And that's what I'm choosing here for the scope. For our collection, I'm just going to simply choose tasks. That's the only one that I need. And then we'll finish the setup for our trigger. Now, before we move on to our operations, I'm going to save this and actually trigger this flow to see what data I'm receiving. I'm just going to pull up a task, mark it as completed, and that should trigger our flow. Now I'm going to go back to the settings, go to our flows, to the flow that we just created, and look at the logs. So the logs are generated each time a flow runs, and it gives you all the relevant data with the flow. Now I'm going to take a close look at my payload. I could see that the task items update is the event. We've got the status, we've got our keys, so the item ID, and our collection. But if I look at the payload status, I see 3 instead of a string completed. And that's because I've got a many-to-one relation set up for task status. It's not just a simple string, it's actually a relational field. Let's have a peek at our task statuses collection. And I'm going to add the ID field to the table just so I can see what status we're targeting in our next operation. We're going to go back to our flow and create that first operation. We want to check to make sure that the task is completed before we update the date completed field. So we're going to use the condition operation. I'll fill the template value from Directus and then I'll adjust to fit my needs. We're going to look inside the trigger payload to verify that the status is equal to the ID 3. And now we're ready for our next operation, which I'm going to give a clever title to get current time. We're going to use the run script operation and just return a simple function to get the current time. We'll save it and move on to the next operation. This operation will be the one where we actually update the item. So I'm just going to call it update date completed and choose the update data operation. For our collection, we'll choose tasks. And for our IDs, I'm going to toggle the raw editor here and I'm going to use the mustache syntax and use $trigger.keys to find the right ID. And for our payload, we're just going to use a JSON object here. We'll pass in that date completed field and use the key from the last operation, get current time, and then we'll access the now property on that specific object. And then we'll save this operation, and that's the basics of our flow. One of my favorite features of flows is the ability to build really robust automations. And I'm just going to create a failure path for our condition that if the status is not completed, I'm just going to log that to the console. But you could use this to send a email notification or take some other action if that condition did not pass. I'll save this operation, save our flow, and now we're ready for testing. Let's go back to one of our tasks, update the status, and see what happens. Now, when I save this item and I go back, we can see that the date completed field was automatically populated based on that flow, and the revisions will show that data that was changed. I can also go back to our flows, check our logs, and see all the different operations that ran when that flow was triggered. And that's it for this use case. Now let's move on to an incredibly common use case for any web project, sending email notifications to your users. So specifically, I want to notify the user whenever they are assigned a task. So now let's hop in and build our flow. We'll go back to our flows, we'll create a new flow in the top right-hand corner, and let's just call this email user when task is assigned. I'm going to give it an icon and a color, and then we'll move on to our trigger setup. So again, I'm going to choose the event hook for the trigger and the action non-blocking type. And for our scopes, I want to fire this whenever a task is created or updated. So I'm going to choose items.create and items.update. And then I'll simply choose tasks for our collection. So the next step is simply saving the trigger. And then I'm going to go in and trigger this flow so we can take a look at the trigger payload for our data. So I'll just open up a task and I'm going to adjust the assign to here from Bart Dempson to myself, save it, and then we're going to open up the logs for our flow and take a look at the trigger payload. As we look at the payload, you can see that we've got the assign to field, which has the Directus user ID. So we're going to need to look up that user at some point, but the next operation that we're going to create is just checking for that assign to field in our trigger payload. So we'll add a new operation here. I'm going to call it check for assignment. This is just going to be a condition where we look for the assign to field. And I'll adjust the condition rules using the Directus filter rules syntax. And I can't remember the null operator that I need here. I just want to check and make sure that the assign to field is not empty. So I'm going to open up the docs and just search for filter rules. If you ever get stuck while you're working with flows, the documentation is great and the team is always adding updates to the documentation. So there's the filter operator that I'm looking for, the in null operator or the not null operator. So I'll just use underscore not null. And I'm just going to type in true here. That's all we need to do for our check for assignment operation. Assuming this condition passes, it will move on to our next operation, which will be to get the user data, specifically the email, so we can send that notification. So I'm just going to call this new operation get user, and we are going to use the read data operation. So we'll pick up our permissions from the trigger. And for our collection, we want that Directus users collection. But that is a system collection, and we're not going to find that in this dropdown. So what I will do here is click Edit Raw Value, and I'm just going to add Directus underscore users. That will allow me to access that collection. I do want to give you a little warning here and just say be careful when using system collections in your flows, especially if you are updating or deleting data. For our IDs field, we are going to again use our mustache syntax and reach inside our trigger.payload and find that user ID from our assign to property. I'll leave the rest of these fields blank and we'll just save this operation. The final operation in this flow is going to be sending that email out to the user. So we'll go up to the success path for the last operation, and we are going to send that email. So surprise, surprise, I'll just call this one email user. Then we will choose send email for the action. Normally you might just enter in an email address in the to field and press enter to save it, but we want to pull the address dynamically. So I'm going to edit the raw value here and use the get user key, so that last operation, and fetch the email property from that. For the subject line, we'll keep it simple and go with something like new task assigned to you. We'll keep the type set to markdown to keep things nice and simple. And then in the body, we will start pecking out our email. We'll again use our mustache syntax and the key of the last operation, get user, to access our first name property to customize that email just a little bit. And then we'll go through and actually add a link to the task. So when the user clicks the link, we want to send them back inside Data Studio to that specific task that they've been assigned. So I'm just going to grab the URL from our address bar and add /content/task at the end. For the last segment of our URL, we're going to go back to our trigger and use the first value inside the keys array. You can use the preview tab to get a peek at what your email will look like. Just be aware that any dynamic variables aren't going to be populated until this flow actually runs. So we'll save this last operation and save our entire flow, and then we're ready to test this out. So I'll open up one of our tasks, change the assigned to field to myself, and wait for that email to come through. While I wait for the magic of the internet, let's open up the specific flow and just take a peek at the logs to make sure that this actually ran. So I could see all the different trigger and operation events here. And if I open up the last one, you can see the actual email that was sent. And there it is in my inbox. I'm just going to drag it over here. You can see new task assigned to you. Hey, Bryant. And when I click this link, it takes me directly to that specific task. And that's how you send email notifications using Directus Flows. On to our next use case. All right, let's move on to another common use case, working with webhooks from third-party systems. Directus Flows makes working with webhooks super simple. There's no need to code a custom API endpoint or reach for some tool like Zapier. In this example, we're going to use a webhook from a third-party CRM called Pipedrive. So we'll just give this a name, catch webhook from CRM, and add an icon and some color to it. Next, we're going to choose the webhook trigger. So this is going to trigger on an incoming HTTP request. And I'm going to choose the post method here because that is what Pipedrive specifies. Next, I will go ahead and save this trigger. And next, I'm going to save this actual flow as well. So on the top right-hand corner, I'll just click the save button. And then I'm going to come to the trigger, and where it has the URL, I'm going to click the copy button. I'm going to need that when I hop inside Pipedrive and set up this webhook. How you set up webhooks in your system is obviously going to vary, but in this case, I'm going to choose the star here, which will fire on all events for a person inside Pipedrive. And then for the endpoint URL, I'm just going to paste in that URL that Directus gave me for that webhook trigger. Now I'll save this one, and then we will hop over to our contact section and create a new contact inside Pipedrive just to test this trigger out. I'm just going to add Ben here, our CEO at Directus, and click save. Now, if I go back to Directus, I should be able to see that this flow was triggered by Pipedrive. And I'll just load up the trigger there, and I could see this is the payload coming from the Pipedrive webhook, and it's pretty detailed. And I'm going to copy and paste this into VS Code, my code editor of choice, so I've got it later as a reference when I am adding an operation for creating or updating people inside my Directus instance. We've confirmed Pipedrive is sending data. Now let's edit this flow and add our next operation, create a new contact. So we'll use the create data type, and the collection that we're going to use here is contacts. And for this one, I'm going to update the permissions to full access because we cannot pick up the permissions from the trigger because that's coming from Pipedrive. I'll just add my payload here, and I'll keep this real simple, just first name, last name, and phone number for now. And I am using the keys from the Pipedrive payload. So we'll try this one more time. We'll hop inside Pipedrive and add Ben, our CEO, and then come back to our flow inside Directus. Check our logs. We can see that there's the data that was sent from Pipedrive. That's great. Let's go in and just search for Ben just to verify. And there's Ben right there. So that's it for this particular use case, receiving webhooks from third-party systems. Let's move on to sending data to third-party systems. Our example here is inside our internal CRM. Anytime a new deal is created, we want to post that message inside our company Slack channel so that our sales reps can stay on top of all those new deals as soon as they come in. So I'm just going to skip over to Slack, and I've set up the basics for an app here, and I'm going to go into the incoming webhooks and make sure those are activated. I'm going to choose our sales team channel inside our Slack workspace, and that's going to generate a URL for me to post a webhook to. Now that I've got my Slack URL that we're going to post to, I'm going to hop back inside Directus and create a new flow. Let's call it something like notify sales team inside Slack for new deals, and then we'll make it nice and beautiful with an icon and a color. For our trigger setup, we're going to choose the event hook. We want it to trigger based on an event inside Directus. We're going to use action non-blocking. And for our scope, we're just going to use items.create. So whenever a new deal is created, and that's the collection that we're going to select, we want to notify Slack. Now that we've got our trigger, let's create our first operation within this flow. I'll just click the add new node, and we will call this send to Slack. We're going to choose the webhook / request URL operation type. For the method, if I switch back over to Slack, you can see that we require a post method with the application JSON content type. So I'll make sure that post is selected. I'll drop my URL in the URL field, and then we'll add a header for the content type just to make sure that matches. For the request body, I'm just going to paste in a previously prepared JSON object that I've created using the Slack block builder toolkit. If you look closely, you can see that I'm using the mustache syntax and the $trigger object to access data from the trigger event. So everything looks pretty good here. Let's just go ahead and save this operation, and then we should be ready to set this flow active. So we'll just use the save button on the top right hand corner, and then we'll go in and create a new deal inside our Directus project. So we'll give it all the values here: status, choose a contact, the company, a deal value, which could be important to our sales reps, and add a short description. Once we're done, we hit save, and if I switch over to Slack, we should see this message pop up immediately. Now, we've also added a link for this, so I can click new deal for Slack, and it will take me directly to that deal inside Directus Data Studio. And that's just one example of how you can use Directus Flows to send data to third-party systems. So that's the crash course on how to automate your workflow for internal apps and tools using Directus Flows. Now you're ready to dive right in and start creating your own automations inside Directus. If you want to learn more about Directus Flows, make sure you check out our other videos on the YouTube channel, or just search for Flows inside the Directus documentation. And don't forget to subscribe to the Directus newsletter to stay up to date with the latest and greatest from the team. Thanks for watching.